On February 19th, the National Museum of the Pacific War held its annual Day of Remembrance. On this day, in 1942, as one response to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. President FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which enabled the U.S. military to intern Japanese Americans. Our guest speaker, Ted Tanaka, reflects on his childhood memories of when he and his family were interned in the Manzanar War Relocation Center.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, my first time to Fredericksburg, and to have the privilege of contributing to your Remembrance Day. My name is Ted Tanaka, and I will go through slides because I think that slides give you 1,000 words, and I'll just supplement it here and there as we go. And so I've titled my talk, which is mainly photographs, The U.S. Imprisonment of American Japanese During World War II. My name is Ted Tanaka from Los Angeles. I was in Manzanar, California, block number 24, barracks number 2, cell number 4 with my parents. This is a picture from August 1941. So if you do your calendar in your head, that's 4 months before Pearl Harbor. And here we were at my parents and my family and my community's West Los Angeles Buddhist temple in August of 1941, having a wonderful time, parents finding very good jobs as a blue collar because they spoke no English or had no knowledge of American culture. So they mainly worked on many fertile farms and flowers, picking of flowers and vegetables and things of that sort throughout Southern California and Orange County. And so this is a picture of one of our early 1941 Obon Matsuri, or we call it Obon Festival. It is a late summer general memorial of our ancestors, which have provided a very good life for ourselves. And this festival was born centuries ago at the Buddhist religion in Japan. Specifically, it's called the Nishi Honganji Jodo Shinshu Buddhist sect. And we continue it whether we had families in London or in Los Angeles or San Francisco, etc. And so here are the girls dressed in the yukata, casual summer kimonos, and it's punctuated by having folk dancing, in the backyard or in the streets. And now we actually have about 500 community people come out both Saturday and Sunday evenings every summer to participate in this. And if you look in the background on the stage, you see a post there. And that little kid there is 3 years old. That's me 80 years ago in my father's arms. And he loved taiko drums. And so that's why he got the privilege of being there. And he thought naturally he's going to take his only son and the firstborn in the United States on his family tree. So what a prized picture it is for me to start off this talk. But then 4 months later, December 7, 1941, the world turned upside down. And it was just pure hell for anyone as an immigrant from Japan or anyone with any % of Japanese ancestry in their blood. And the Navy did a sneak attack. This is the USS Arizona, but many other ships that were harbored during a quiet spell, and most of the military of the United States was, in the harbor. They died along with those ships, over 2,000 of them. And so within 12 hours of Pearl Harbor, 12 hours, this is a photograph in downtown LA of the two gentlemen with the white hats in a fairly young organization called Federal Bureau of Investigation. But this was 1941, and the legal system was much more simplistic. So Sunday night, they went into the homes. They had the names of 100 leaders of Japanese in Los Angeles. They were ministers, they were language school teachers, they were heads of a Japanese bank, etc. So they were considered leaders. And the fear was that the Japanese would have some kind of ties, or some of them maybe used to belong to the Japanese Navy, who knows? and might help the enemy go from Hawaii onto the Pacific shores. And so they simply routed up these 100 or so community leaders. They were already on a list from the 1930s. And 100 of them got pulled right out of dinner. No warrant, no paperwork, no explanation why they were being taken at gunpoint, or where they were going, or how long they were going. But this young organization called the Federal Bureau of Investigation were told, get them controlled. Don't leave them out in the open. So in they went to a 1930s Job Corps camp of the Depression U.S. government, and here was an empty place that could hold 2,000 for weeks or months. Just 14 miles from Los Angeles City Hall in what is now called Verdugo, just northwest of Pasadena, California. And it's been converted now, after all these decades, into a golf course, Verdugo Golf Course. And at the same time, then starting January, February, even before the Executive Order 9066, the San Francisco Examiner newspaper says, the ouster of all Japs in California near. And so they knew that Executive Order 9066 was being worked on. And so it even inspired cartoonists to draw a cartoon that ran in magazines and newspapers. This is pre-television. And on the top line, it says, waiting for the signal from home, which meant looking west across the Pacific toward Japan. And the sign on the top of that hut there says, Honorable Fifth Column. And here's a picture of the stereotype slit-eyed Japanese with buck teeth and glasses and hats on, lining up from California to Oregon to Washington, and Ruth Ann's birthplace, British Columbia, each being handed out cartons of TNT. And if you look at the bottom, this is drawn by Dr. Zeus. So, sure enough, once the Executive Order 9066 came out, signed by FDR, that he authorized the Defense Department to create safety for the nation. This was an emergency crisis. So that defined the ability to get into the executive order by the President of the United States procedure. And out came on every street corner from British Columbia down through San Diego, post signs like this with slightly different dates in every major city. But all of them were consistent in one thing. These were posted in March, April, May, June, mostly, in those 4 months. And in each poster in that area, the locals who read that poster were told, here's the date by which you will report to an assembly control point with one piece of luggage. And you have 6 calendar days to get out of your business, your profession, your house, your washing machine, whatever it is, and you are no longer free. So before the 6 days, we were told to register our names. We were given a 6-digit U.S. identification number for what euphemistically is called the incarceration. But I don't like the euphemism because it's, what's it camouflaging? We were prisoners. We couldn't go. We were told where jail was. And so here we were on the given day. You couldn't be a day early or a day late because the transportation and everything was set up. And you had to report with your ID number. And all you knew, well, you didn't know where you were going, but you knew that the government was saying, you know, you're now a prisoner. You're now an incarceree. You don't have a life. We are your life. So here they are with one piece of luggage getting on board a bus or a train, going to some camp, and where they, of course, had never seen before. Now, some of them, you know, when that executive order came out on February 19, 1942, and were given 1 week, I mean, the U.S. Army, the U.S. nation, didn't have a place to put 120,000 people. Yeah? And so they had to start hustling to figure out where to put these people. And, you know, and there were different populations of Japanese people, you know, along the West Coast. So this is an actual picture from the Los Angeles Santa Anita racetrack, where the huge parking lot was converted into rapid overnight military tar paper barracks, because at least the one thing they had were they had plans on how to make tar paper barracks, and they knew the detailed procedures on what tools and hardware you needed to make it, in what steps, how many people you needed to have on a team to get these. So they made these, hundreds per day, because they had to do it for 120,000 people, in weeks, at most in months. And this happened in places, other parts of the United States, where you just couldn't suddenly pick up 120,000 and move them here and there into what was really imprisonment. This is one of the classic books in English, which records into history what happened to the Japanese American during this first incarceration of people by some classification called Behind Barbed Wires. And I show this picture proudly and poignantly because this old man is a paternal grandfather of my wife. Mr. Aso came from Oita Prefecture. No English, no money, no culture, but by his bootstraps, he created a dyeing business and a dry cleaning business near Oakland, California. And the one thing, I'm sure that you could see on his face, you may control where I go, but I know who I am. I have my own dignity and I have my own pride. And you can see that so clearly written on his face, together with a couple of my wife's first cousins. So this is a picture taken by one of the 3 photographers hired by the War Relocation Authority, U.S. government. This was taken by Dorothea Lange, who I think took the greatest number of pictures during World War II, and some of them closer to honest pictures. This was May 8, 1942 in Hayward, California. They were in East Bay, California, and they were getting ready to board a bus. Each had their 6-digit ID tag number on their lapel, and that's all that mattered. And they were getting onto these designated buses by the War Relocation Authority staff members, basically U.S. Army soldiers, and they were going from Hayward to San Bruno, California, which is near SFO Airport, to Tanforan racetracks, which, like Santa Anita, were rapidly converted, and they built up in the parking spaces at least these tar paper sheds where they could put people, they could at least have a roof over their head. But there was no plumbing in those things, because that took a lot of time to put plumbing in. There was 1 light bulb per room, and then there was no kitchen. You had to go to a mess hall. And so suddenly, Tanforan Racetrack Assembly Center grew to more than 5,000 people. I went in West Los Angeles to Camp Manzanar directly without going through an assembly center. But in 6 months, in 1942, from about spring to fall in 1942, Manzanar became the largest city between Los Angeles and Reno. In weeks, it became 10,000. More about that later. So here we are, people arriving at this destination. All they knew was they were somewhere in the desert. Most of these locations were in the desert, isolated from any other population, so that it would at least create so-called security or safety from the enemy, from the aliens. And I thought it'd be educational for you today to see that in the United States there were 10 confinement sites. Nice euphemism again for prisons. There were 2 in California, where I went to Manzanar in Central East, next door to Death Valley. Not a pleasant place. The other one was near Mount Shasta, way at the north end. And then Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. And then, I don't know why it happened, but there were 2 camps in Arkansas, in the southeast swamps, where there was no population of Americans in Arkansas. So there were 10 camps for the duration of the war. And that's where we all ended up, somewhere around 1940, late 42, until whenever there was going to be an end to the war. And so this was the front entrance to what became the first home that I can remember in my life. It said Manzanar War Relocation Center. And this is the entrance. And on the right, on the left side, that hut is still there. It's on the highway right up to Mammoth Mountain Ski Resort. And the mountains you see in the background is the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. So right over that hill and just a little bit north is Yosemite National Park. Yeah. And just the next peak left is Mount Whitney, the highest mountain in the continental United States. And so here was a typical scene of people getting off the train, off the bus, off of American friends' car who offered to drive them to Manzanar, finding out where we are. And they said, oh my God, this place is dusty. It's a long ways away. It's dusty, but we have no choice. We have to go there. And so here's an overview shot of what a camp looked like. It was tar paper barracks in a place that we would be isolated. And so in the mountains there you see the eastern slopes of the Sierra. That's actually Mount Williamson, and to the left end it will be Mount Whitney. And at the ground level, there it was, no vegetation. They were just rolled in. They put in those army barracks like they were making a brand new army fort. And this is Manzanar. And one of the scariest first memories I had as a 4-year-old was seeing these big round things bouncing slowly along the ground. And I thought, God, is that a tiger or an elephant? I was scared to hell. I found out that was sagebrush. But there was a lot of sagebrush, together with scorpions, rattlesnakes, and jackrabbits, you name it. It was no man's land. But you couldn't help but recognize, well, wait a minute, first of all, in 1 square mile, there were rows and rows of 10 feet high barbed wire. So that said something. And then every half a mile, 8 of these around the camp were these lookout towers, where 24 hours, a U.S. military with a machine gun would be watching 24 hours off the top of that. And that black thing there you see is a spotlight, because you couldn't go after, I think, 8 p.m. at night. And if they did, they found you, they threw that spotlight on you. So, you know, as a little aside, I hold back from calling it a concentration camp because, you know, I'm an American kid and I went to public schools in LA. Concentration camps were death camps of the Jews by the Nazis. You know, we went in here, I think, you know, my parents knew they were not there to be exterminated, but we were there to be isolated for sure, unwillingly. So it was a jail, it was a prison, but we weren't there to be exterminated. So I like to call it, using plain English, just call it prison. That's what the hell it was. You know? And so to give you a little further idea, here's an overview of what our camp looked like. And this is pretty true for most of the places because they didn't have any time to customize. They were just throwing up army forts, so to speak, to handle 120,000 people. So this is Manzanar camp, and it was 1 square mile, barbed wire, sentry towers, 1 entrance and exit you saw with that stone hut, and there were 36 blocks. And when you did the multiplication, this held exactly 10,800. And so there were 36 blocks, so each block looked the same. And here's what it looked like. Each block, and my block 24, on the top right was a mess hall because they had to centralize the kitchen and the cooking and storing of the foods. But then you see 14 barracks, all identical, tar paper barracks with a plywood floor. And in each barrack, 1 through 14 were 4 cells. So I was in block 24, barracks 2, cell 4. They call it apartment. I'm sure this was American-made illustration. But in the middle, at the top, was an ironing room, then a laundry room, women's latrine, and a men's latrine. And so that's where the plumbing was there and the mess hall, because it was too much to do for each cell. Each cell had 1 heater, 1 light bulb, and 20 feet by 24 feet. And as a side story, since it was just my mother and father from Japan and me, there were 3. These cells were made for about 6 or 7 people. So when we went in, you know, of course, and they were trying to squeeze 10,000 into 1 square mile, into 36 blocks, 14 barracks each. So another parents, mother and father with a child, moved into our same cell number 4. And then, so the parents, what they did was they just took a bed sheet and hung it on in between for privacy. Here's a recent, to scale, reconstruction of what it looked like inside. You were given a blanket, you were given a pillowcase, and you were given a sheet bag. And your father went outside where they dumped a pile of hay, and he stuffed the bag, and that became our mattress and our pillow. And one story I remember as a side, after we were there a year, why did I wake up in the morning? I looked around at other people and myself, and when we first woke up, I had powder on one side of my face. And I looked around at my mom and dad, and they had the same thing. And I realized then that the dry humidity of the desert shrunk the knots in the pine wood. And when it dropped out of the hole, at night the winds would blow through the knot holes, and we would be covered on the side that was facing upward during night with dust from the desert. So there's a lot of learning. So any leisure time was probably after working in the fields. The father didn't want to be inside, it was too hot. It's 120 degrees in the summer, and in winter it was freezing. So he was relaxing, I think, before going to the mess hall for dinner. They threw up these latrines as fast as they could because they had people at the assembly centers waiting to get in. This is a replication to scale of the ladies' toilet. Not much privacy. And to the conservative, shy Japanese mothers and daughters, I mean, it was horrific. And so someone did a cartoon summarizing it. You know, some would go with their towels and try to hang it up for a little bit of privacy. Some just closed their face or found a piece of scrap wood to have a little privacy. And one of my friends still today, Masako, she said she was 8 years old when she went to camp, and she remembered as an 8-year-old, when she went to bath after dinner, she always did it in a bathing suit. And so here are kids naturally school age, or they had been in elementary school or junior high school when the war broke out, and got organized. And at Manzanar, there were kids from like 200 different kind of schools suddenly going into one building for elementary school and one building for secondary school. And naturally, in just a few months, where could they find desks and chairs? I mean, they were lucky enough to find teachers. And quite a number of Caucasian teachers signed up because maybe they weren't married or didn't have family, they were independent. They could physically have the flexibility to do this, something really rather unusual, to sign a contract to teach at something new called an internment camp. The teachers figured out, I know some of the students that are going to be there. And one of my best friends, Rose Honda, she said she reported to 10th grade at Manzanar High School, and she walked in the room and she said, "Mrs. Hayes, what are you doing here?" And she remembered her from 6th grade in West Los Angeles. But this is late during the internment or imprisonment. We finally had chairs, no tables. The first few weeks, I'm sure many students sat on the floor, and if it was summertime, hot, they sat outside the barracks, this classroom, because it was cooler outside, sitting on the sand. And one friend told me that in their class, when it got time to learn typing, the teacher took a piece of paper, 8.5 by 11, and drew on there the keys of all the numerals and the letters, and made copies of that and passed it out so that so students could at least have a paper that resembled the keyboard for them to begin learning where the numbers and letters were. And so it was just seat of the pants do whatever you could to these many kids. And on weekends, there was no school. The Japanese, many of them had been doing baseball and organized, and they thought that could include a number of players and the mom and dads in the audience. It grew to such a organized, semi-amateur in-camp activity that the camps between themselves actually had inter-camp playoffs with the approval of the players to go by special bus to another camp for the purpose of a tournament. And the girls naturally wanted to have their part of it too, so they designed all kinds of activities to keep themselves busy. And I took this picture right out of the handbook or the yearbook of the Manzanar High School, 1944. And my dear friend, Arnold Maeda, turns out by coincidence, he was in cell 4 in 1942. He was age 15 and I was 3. And he came up to me a few years ago and he said, I know where you were in 1942. And he said, you don't remember me because I was 15 and I knew you were only 3. And I said, I don't remember you. He says, well, me and my dad were on the other side of that bed sheet for 6 months. He became class president of the 1944 Manzanar senior team, senior class. And to finish this photograph, the fellow on the bottom right doesn't look like a Japanese face. In fact, he's a Caucasian face, and his name is Ralph Lazo, L-A-Z-O. He's Irish Mexican. You know, he's not Japanese. But he said, since kindergarten, all my friends are Japanese Americans. You know, they're going to be gone. I don't have anybody to play with. So he went to the office of the War Relocation Authorities and he convinced them that he was Japanese American. He just thought that he's signing up in Belmont High School downtown and he'd be with his friends. Well, as it turned out, his friends all got sent to Hart Mountain, Wyoming, and he got sent to Manzanar in Central California. But he fit in, and he was publicity manager for the senior class of 44 in Manzanar Camp. And so a part of this talk I dedicated in the memory of Ralph Lazo. So graduations were done without any facility or budget. You know, we just got some chairs together, got a homemade stage out in the open. On that same stage, I remember one Sunday night a month, they would show some old Japanese motion picture, and we would sit on the sand. But they even went so far as to create, back at home, a graduation program, commencement program for Sunday evening, June 18. And I'm sure they said 8 o'clock because the desert was pretty hot at 6 o'clock. On the sideline, some of the daughters and mothers, if they felt inclined, could make a little bit of side money. They could volunteer, and the Army offered jobs if the ladies would make camouflage screens for the U.S. Marines and Army. And they got paid $12 a month. The fathers, after work, they were unanimously convinced that throughout all this, they wanted to live in America. They came out of a Japan that was in depression, practically starvation, lots of fatality due to starvation. But what caught my eye were these immigrant fathers wanting to learn how to read an English book, and there's a teacher that is teaching them after hours, after dinner. Yet you look at the background and there's this big poster in English that says, "Democracy at Work," and the Statue of Liberty in the prison to these some American-borns. I thought, what a contradiction. I show this as a piece of artwork that my mother did. She had never heard of the word embroidery, and with hundreds of mothers who had all this time because they didn't have to cook. My dad was one of 3 men who volunteered to be on a 3-man cooking team to make gohan. Gohan is a Japanese word for steamed rice. And we Japanese ate rice breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And we had to feed at each meal 300 at Block 24 mess hall. And so people like my mom spent hundreds of hours learning embroidery because they had the time. They had the interest to learn something new. They thought, well, maybe sometime after we were released, this will be both a memento and some sort of a family heirloom. And so this is hand-stitched from about 1,000 different color threads, needle by needle. And they learned how to painstakingly take different shades of brown or different shades of gray to create an art form of an embroidery sewn. And my mother made 4 of these because she had the time. But what a rare thing. So I think later I'm going to perhaps consider giving it to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. This is a picture, sadly, of a very popular young lady who had gotten married and was about to have her first child. And due to the low education and experience level of medical doctors in our hospital, and there was usually 1 building per camp that had a hospital of varying degrees of medical expertise, she passed away of hemorrhaging during her first birth of her child, and was a very popular family in Manzanar Camp. Halfway through the encampment or incarceration, the Army began hearing rumors of younger Japanese Americans being rebellious about being forced into camp. People like my parents, no English, no culture, no money. They couldn't rebel. They couldn't even speak English. They had never even seen a questionnaire, let alone in a foreign language. So they had to trust somebody to translate this 2-page questionnaire. And I highlighted question 28 in yellow, which I'll read. It says, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japan Emperor or other foreign government, power, or organization?" And my parents, no English, no money. I mean, this is the U.S. government against them as an individual or as a small community. What could they do? I mean, they had to say, we forswear any allegiance. We do not have allegiance to Japan. But there were younger members who were maybe in college, some studying law, and others, just a few others, who rose to the situation and said, "This is not lawful. We studied in high school the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and we studied the 14th Amendment, which said anyone born in the United States is a U.S. citizen and entitled to live democratically and peacefully under our Bill of Rights, Constitution, and Amendment 14, which specifically said, if you are born in the United States, you are entitled to and due process of law." First of all, those fathers in Los Angeles that got taken on the same December 7, 1941, weren't even shown a piece of paper, not even given any words as to where they were going, why they were going, and how long they were going to be there. Nor us, and these younger people thought, we shouldn't be in a camp. We did not have due process of law. And so one of them I'll show a picture of in a moment. But while this was going on, coming into 1943, the U.S. was feeling it needed more soldiers in Europe to fight the Germans, who had a number of new technology weapons and submarines and cannons. So this is a picture taken inside of Manzanar Camp in our prison of some 1,500 American-born Japanese who were first put into camp with the parents and then drafted out of the same camp to join the U.S. Army, you know? And there were, from the 10 camps, there were about 1,500 who volunteered to join the 100th Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which became famous as being from Hawaii. About 10,000 from Hawaii created this segregated Japanese military unit. And that military unit astounded the U.S. forces. First of all, they showed up after basic training in Italy, and their commander, you know, was some 6'5" American guy looking down at these guys who averaged 5'2", and he thought, "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" But with time, the feeling of esprit de corps, camaraderie, of most of these fellows from Hawaii who spoke pidgin English, so that clashed heads a little bit with some Japanese Americans from California, Oregon, who didn't know pidgin English. And one of the terms that came out of that was learning the term "go for broke." And if you've never heard of the term "go for broke," it's a kind of a pidgin English for saying, you know, give it all you got, give it hell, you know, or as the Japanese would say, "gambatte." And so this 442nd 100th Brigade Battalion went on to France and into Germany, and they knew they had this identity of being all Japanese, the only one in the U.S. military service history that was all Japanese. And they pulled together and they said, no one's going to defeat us. We're going to show them. It doesn't matter how many die. We were on a mission. And that's why wherein came out the term "go for broke." And you'll hear from that again later. So they found themselves in France, nearing Germany, the south part of Germany. And the commanding general in that area had sent up 2 teams up a steep mountainside, which was approachable only from one side. You couldn't go in from the north or the south. And at the top, you didn't know what the hell was up there, but you knew there were Nazis up there. The first 2 groups came back with huge casualties. And so the general was about to give that up. And finally, someone suggested, let the Japanese go for broke team give it a try. And so they put their heads together. And as tired as they were from fighting earlier battles, they went up that mountain. And sure enough, they found German machine guns well in place, all along the left and right and at the top. But they persevered. And they developed a strategy at one point where they felt they could go around and actually sneak up behind. And that group of American soldiers that were caught 2/3 of the way up that mountain were all from Texas and became known as the Texas Battalion that was saved by this Japanese-American group. And that story even continued on to the late 1940s when there began to be talk in Washington, D.C. of converting the territory of Hawaii to a state. And the people in Washington, D.C. initially said, well, first of all, they don't look like us, and we've never been there, and it's too far away. What the hell interest do we have in making such a place a state? Then stepped up a couple of politicians you may know the name of, Lyndon Baines Johnson and Sam Rayburn. And they remembered the Texas Battalion that was saved by the Japanese. And quickly, the votes in Washington turned to approve Hawaii Territory as a state in the early 50s. Here's a picture of a U.S. Japanese soldier drafted out of camp having a wedding. The only place he could have a wedding was where his parents and her parents could join the wedding ceremony. And they were all in Manzanar camp. So he flew back to Manzanar camp. One end of one of the barracks was converted whenever there were any needed services. And I know the name of Reverend Nagatomi, the senior most minister at Manzanar, in front of a Buddhist altar, marrying this couple. And then the next day he was back off going to Europe. So here's some soldiers on the field rounding up Nazi youngsters and taking them to a prisoner of war camp. This Japanese battalion and regimental combat team went on in Germany. They were the first ones to actually go near Munich in southwest Germany. And they really were the first ones who founded the famed Dachau concentration camps with 100 locations around Munich. And they, along their career, earned over 9,400 Purple Hearts and many Medal of Honors. And so they became known in the U.S. Army for their size, the most medaled combat team and battalion, and they became known as the Purple Heart Battalion in the history of the United States Army. Many soldiers had never been to Europe. They fell in love with little kids in Italy and France in the hillsides who had never tasted or seen chocolates. So they gave their ration of chocolates to the kids. And to this day, there are villages in Italy and France where they celebrate the day that the Japanese liberated them from the Nazis. And to this day, they have a Remembrance Day holiday, and they exchange people to remember what happened on that day. They were liberated from the Nazis. Here's another soldier returning back to Manzanar while he was given a chance for R&R and talking to his mother and his father. And you'll see in the background above the mother's head that she has a frame there showing 3 stars, a star for each son. So from camp, she has 3 sons volunteering in Europe to be members of the U.S. Army. And the one frame on the right with 1 star is one son who died in service. And in the field, makeshift, but this battalion had their own form of military funeral service to their fellow men who died. And in the camp where the parents were living, they also remembered on the same day in memory of their son. And in the foreground, you could see that the young Japanese-American boys, when they packed up their one luggage to go to camp, they at least took their Boy Scout uniforms with them. At Manzanar, this is a monument to remember all the souls of that live there and lost their lives there, as well as in the war. Want to make a quick note about a specific governor named Ralph R. Carr. He was governor of Colorado from 1939 to 1943, and he defied everyone, and he raised his hands and he said, the state of Colorado will release you from prison in those 10 camps if you come to Colorado in 1943 and set up a permanent life in our state. And so here's my stepsister, Hideko, with her boyfriend, fiance, just married, Sumiji Hori, in Poston, Arizona in camp. And a month later, they were on their way to Keensburg, Colorado, to start working on a farm. They lived 77 years in Colorado. She passed away a year ago, and grandchildren are still there. But once the war ended, still we knew we were facing this kind of attitude. This is a picture from Kent, Washington. A retail store cashier says, we don't want any Japs back here ever. You know? And back in Los Angeles, you came back to where you thought was your old neighborhood, and there were spray can paints there saying, no Japs wanted. So, you know, those feelings don't go away fast. But I was very fortunate. My dad worked for 10 years in the 1930s as a Beverly Hills gardener, and all his gardeners liked him and he liked them. And so one of them said, our neighbor has a lot of extra rooms. You can stay at their place when you come back. So much to my surprise, I went from one night in a barracks in 1945 in Manzanar, and the next night I was in this house 1 block south of the Beverly Hills Hotel. It was just a little mind-boggling to this kid. I didn't know what was happening and why. But I wound up grade 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade in Beverly Hills. Every one of these kids were my friends, no racial feelings whatsoever. I'm in the front row, 3rd from the right, and still see a number of these kids. We just had our 70th reunion of 3rd graders. One of the famous young men who stood up against and said, I know that our Constitution has Amendment 14, and we were not given due process of law. Fred Korematsu is one of the 3 or 4 names which rose up when he was a young man during the war. And later in 1998, President Clinton awarded him the Medal of Freedom. So this caused a lot of memories from 2 years ago when people started about removing by executive order Muslims. And that's when I began thinking that, we've got to keep this memory alive so that we don't repeat the history. And it made me think in closing, why am I doing this? Why am I standing here talking? I'm not trying to get emotional feelings about us Japanese. I am trying to get feelings about understanding what happens to a group of immigrants or something like that who suddenly get moved aside. But the real purpose for my talk is how not to repeat this from happening 5 years from now, 50 years from now. And it lies, and I'm still researching this, and it lies somewhere in the process which exists today of how you get an executive order drafted and approved like FDR, or in some cases, a few times, I think last President Trump was suggesting such actions against the Muslims. And I think, fortunately, part of the answer must lie in social media, and YouTube, this is I think going to be on YouTube, making communications much more rapid, so that this kind of 1942 assembly of emotion doesn't justify a president to think he's doing the right thing by signing the incarceration of 100,000 people. So that wraps up my talk. Here are the credits from where I can receive the photographs.
Well, thank you so much, Ted, for your talk. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
The National Museum of the Pacific War would like to give special thanks to Ted Tanaka for sharing his family's story. Please visit pacificwarmuseum.org for webinars and more videos like this.